Thanks, Aviva, and thank you very much to the Research Forum for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. Vincent van Gogh holds a unique place in the popular imagination. Crowds flock to exhibitions, and his most iconic works have become the destination of tourist pilgrimages. Here, visitors to Starry Night at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Up Fifth Avenue at the Met, the danger posed by crowding and visitors inadvertently backing into our self-portrait as they take selfies has prompted a move to a larger gallery and protecting the painting with a new Perspex case. The retrospective romance of his troubled life, the poignant brevity of his career as an artist, just 10 years, the remarkable narrative provided by his letters, and most importantly, the brilliance of his vision capture our imagination. A couple of years ago, when conservator Mary Schaefer at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City found a grasshopper trapped in the paint of olive trees, the story went viral. It offered a little window into his life and practice that hit a nerve. We want to know as much about him as we can. The study of artist materials and techniques can advance fresh insights into the creative process not accessible any other way. While the examination, analysis, and technical imaging of paintings has a long history, it's only in the last few decades that technical study has been considered a fundamental component of art historical research. Technical art history has gained momentum due to advances in analytical methods and imaging and the collaborative efforts of conservators, scientists, and art historians. Here at the Courtauld, Paintings Pairs, where graduate art history and conservation students jointly investigate a work of art, is a popular research opportunity. It's no surprise that Van Gogh has been a prime focus of such interdisciplinary studies, one of the first of which was the National Gallery Technical Bulletin's 1987 article on wheat field with cypresses, about which more soon. The concentration of his paintings in the Netherlands and the long-standing commitment of the Van Gogh Museum and the Cultural Heritage Agency, or RCE, to technical investigation have fostered groundbreaking studies that have reached across the scholarly community and into popular culture. When the Van Gogh Museum reopened in 2013, the inaugural exhibition was on the artist's working practice. It was accompanied by 2 publications, one for specialists, it's become something of a Bible for Van Gogh specialists, and one for a general audience. The Van Gogh Museum and the RCE have partnered with many institutions within the Netherlands and worldwide, and each new exhibition and study builds on the existing body of research. A key recent initiative is the Weave Count Automation Project. Using X-rays of paintings, computer and electrical engineers have devised signal processing software to count and map the threads in canvas supports with precision, allowing them to identify canvases that came from the same bolt. With the collaboration of the Van Gogh Museum and the sharing of X-rays by the Met and other institutions, there's now an archive of thread density maps of over half his approximately 800 paintings. By aligning this data with canvas he ordered and received gleaned from the letters, we're learning more about his choices of canvas supports and addressing lingering questions of chronology. All this sounds incredible, and it is. But the more data we have, the more questions arise. Bolts could be as much as 100 meters long. The closest matches are weft matches, like those in this Burlington article, as wefts were only 3 meters wide. Thread density maps are also valuable for questions of attribution. The Met's self-portrait, painted in Paris in 1887, is on the reverse of a Noonan period work from 2 years earlier. While we don't have any doubts about the attribution, it has been questioned in the past. So it's valuable to have the thread density data that matches the canvas to the same bolt as 7 other paintings from 1885 to 87. And 2 of these are weft matches. Like the self-portrait, the skull on the right is a Paris period work on a canvas that was first painted with a Noonan period head of a woman. The Met has in its collection 17 paintings dating from 1885 in Noonan through his Paris years, 1886-87, Hale in Provence, where he traveled in early 88, his time in Saint-Rémy, and finally Auvers. This bouquet was probably painted shortly before his death in July 1890. Cypresses and sunflowers were the first paintings to enter the collection in 1949. And in the 1990s, we were fortunate to receive these 7 paintings, first as promised gifts and then part of the bequest of Walter and Lenora Annenberg. Technical study of the Van Goghs in our collection goes hand in hand with art historical research by Susan Stein, Engelhardt Curator in the Department of European Paintings. Some of what you'll be seeing today comes from Susan's updating of the Annenberg collection catalogue published in 2009. But of course, the study of our paintings is ongoing, driven by our collections and exhibitions and those of our colleagues in other institutions. The paintings I'm going to focus on all come from the 12-month period, May 1889 to 90, that Van Gogh was voluntarily a patient at the asylum of Saint Paul de Mossol, a former monastery on the outskirts of the village of Saint-Rémy, for a condition diagnosed by his doctors as a form of epilepsy. In between debilitating attacks of his illness, it was a time of dazzling artistic production as he painted subjects within the asylum grounds and when allowed to venture beyond in the surrounding countryside, where he fixed on cypress trees. He described them in a letter to his brother, Theo, as beautiful as regards lines and proportions, like an Egyptian obelisk. The painting on the left is from late June and wheat field with cypresses around the same time. Both have the same storybook profile of the Alpine Mountains in the distance. Not his invention, they really do look like that. Both were painted in situ, thickly and directly, and bear traces of the outdoors. Cypresses has a constellation of embedded gravel in the impasto of the foreground, and a wheat husk was found in the paint of wheat field when it was cleaned in 1993. Not as dramatic as a grasshopper, but likewise evidence of where they were made. It may be surprising that Van Gogh considered these magnificent paintings to be studies, études. Gauguin had exhorted him to paint from his imagination, but this approach didn't sit well with him. He needed to paint from the motif, and found the abstractions of Gauguin and Émile Bernard, in his words, artificial and affected. His way of producing a finished painting, the tableau définitif, was to make studio repetitions of the on-the-spot study, distilling his initial impression into something more considered. As he explained to Bernard, I exaggerate. Sometimes I make changes to the subject, but still I don't invent the whole of the painting. On the contrary, I find it ready-made, but to be untangled in the real world. Van Gogh painted 3 versions, the Annenberg canvas, the painting in the National Gallery. Both of these are standard size 30 figure, that is 73 by 92 centimeters, a format he used a lot, and a smaller repetition, now in a private collection, painted for his mother and sister. While scholars generally agree which size 30 canvas came first, this wasn't always the case. The Technical Bulletin article broke new ground by establishing the order based in part on technical examination. The X-rays of the paintings are, as you see, quite different. The London version on the right has areas of density like the ears of wheat, but in much of the landscape, the paint was applied more thinly and evenly. Compare, for example, the cypress trees and their surrounding landscapes. In the Annenberg study, there's high contrast between these areas due to the thick application of what's likely lead white in the sky and mountains, whereas in the London version, the paint is thinly applied and he used less dense zinc white, so there's barely any difference. He used the in-situ study to make the London version in the studio in September as he recuperated from an attack of his illness. He wrote to Theo that he'd sent 12 number 30 canvases, but there will be almost the same ones twice, the study and the final painting. The untangled London version is, as you see, more stylized and decorative, with a greater sense of overall rhythm. It's also brighter in colour. We'll have the opportunity to see the paintings side by side at the Met in 2023 in an exhibition on Van Gogh's cypresses currently being worked on by Susan Stein. In preparation for the exhibition, my colleague, research scientist Sylvia Centeno, will be doing pigment analysis. It'll be especially interesting in regard to the more subdued appearance of the Met study. Did he use more yellow ochre, a quieter yellow than the chrome identified in the London version? Or is it possible that he used chrome in a form that's darkened due to light sensitivity, as determined in the recent research on the sunflowers by the Van Gogh Museum and the National Gallery? X-rays can show more clearly the anatomy of brushwork. In this detail from where the field meets the mountain, both painted tremendously thickly, Van Gogh took his brush and drew it through the wet paint to create the division, painting by subtraction rather than addition. Here you can see the loaded brushstrokes worked wet into wet with colours dragged and blended as he worked at speed to capture the scene. And here the X-ray shows the vigorous and varied brushwork with which he recorded the different zones of the wheat field, short, impasted dabs for the ears of wheat, staccato hatching for the stems, and calligraphic whirls for the grass. I love this. For me, the focus and intensity of every single brushstroke, and of course this is just a small detail, goes a long way to explaining why we're pulled across the room to gaze at these pictures. Up until the 1850s, artists were buying their pigments from colour merchants either as powder or mixed with oil and stored in pig's bladders like these. The collapsible metal tube was invented in 1841 and completely changed the way that paints could be stored, transported, and used. To give tube colours a good working consistency and to ensure shelf life, bulking agents and stabilizers were added, which meant that the paint coming out of tubes had a stiff, buttery consistency. The pastos furrowed brushwork that we associate with Van Gogh wouldn't have been possible a few decades earlier. In his reed pen drawings sent to Theo to show him the study, his mark making is similarly varied. He translates into monochrome the different features and colours of the landscape, with a range of hatching, dots, and areas left blank. In the summer of 1889, he also became captivated by the olive groves that surrounded the asylum, as they still do. The hardy, sun-beaten trees became, like the cypresses, potent symbols of Provence. After an attack of his illness, in the summer, he resumed painting olive trees in the autumn, now capturing the groves from a slightly higher viewpoint, with the sky as a larger part of the composition. Of this group, the Met has olive trees, and the final work of the series, women picking olives. We followed up on technical examination that we did for the update of the Annenberg catalogue with a new study for an upcoming exhibition, Van Gogh and the Olive Groves, opening next June at the Van Gogh Museum and then moving to the Dallas Museum of Art. Organized by Ninka Bakker and Katrine Piltz at the Van Gogh Museum and Nicole Myers in Dallas. All the paintings in this series are being examined by the conservators and scientists in their respective collections, and the findings will be drawn together in the catalogue and featured in the exhibition. Here's the group at a meeting in the Met in October. Van Gogh's olive groves were in part a response to Gauguin and Bernard's depictions of Christ in the Garden of Olives. He was outraged by what he called their dreaming and abstractions, and resolved instead to capture the hard and coarse realism of the groves in paintings that he said would smell of the soil. He wrote to Theo in November, "I've been messing about in the groves morning and evening in very beautiful clear sunshine, and the result is 5 number 30 canvases, which, with the 3 studies that you have, at least constitute an attack on the problem. His direct observations compare with a recent photograph of olive cultivation in Provence, showing mulch around the tree trunks, a feature emphasized in the Met canvas. I wonder if it hadn't been freshly applied. And that it was at least begun outside is suggested by the presence of grains of sand embedded in the paint. He seems to have painted the foreground at speed, with areas of the white ground left in between the brushstrokes. In this detail, taken through the microscope, you can see the painted contours with which he laid in different compositional areas. And here, the underpaint with which he quickly blocked in the zones of sunlit earth, thinned with so much turpentine that it dripped down the canvas. Next, he added hatched strokes of impasto wet into wet so that the colors marbled together. The trees, and especially the sky, on the other hand, are much more heavily worked, with strokes added over dry underlayers. Once your eye is attuned to the pale pointillist dabs in the sky and the trees, you might recognize this second campaign. In this detail, you can see bright green paint, also part of the second campaign, sitting on a dry underlayer, adding a vibrant color contrast with the existing red outlines. More on this effect shortly. The Annenberg Women Picking Olives was his definitive statement of the series. It's based not only on the studies from the summer and autumn, but also on two versions of the same composition, now in the Goulandris collection, recently opened in Athens, and the National Gallery, Washington. Around December 19th, he wrote Theo that he was working on a picture of women gathering olives. The ground is violet and farther off yellow ochre, the sky entirely pink and three small figures pink too. It was, he said, based on a study of the same size done on the spot. A few days later, he wrote to his mother about a version he was making for her, noting its pink sky and purplish soil, all the colors more subdued than usual. Updating the Annenberg catalogue, Susan reconsidered the relationship between these three based on documentary evidence of their provenance and technical examination, as well as discussion with our colleagues in Washington when we went to examine their version. While our painting had generally been associated with the repetition for his mother and sister, which of the other versions came first wasn't yet clear, in part because his description of pink sky and pink figures didn't tally with the appearance of either. You may be able to see that the Goulandris version is the most thickly painted, and this is now identified as the in situ study, while the Washington version, more schematic, evokes his description of a studio rendition done from memory after a study made on the spot, because I want something far away, like a vague memory softened by time, now softened all the more due to fading. He made changes as he took up each new canvas. The first is like a snapshot recording the scene. The second is simplified. The figure group is enlarged and moved more centrally. In the Annenberg picture, the group is centered, and the picker on the right, young, curvaceous, and on tiptoe in the Washington version, has become blocky and angular. In this important feature, the workers, he continued to make changes. Though the women's clothing in the Annenberg picture had started out as entirely pink, he subsequently repainted the dresses blue and the skirt green. He abandoned the filled apron or basket of the woman in the middle, replacing it with staccato touches of foliage, having given the basket to the woman on the right. In a telling detail, her waistband, initially curved, was repainted as angular segments that mirror the waistband of her neighbor. The net result is an overall stylization with rhythmic brushwork, not recording a scene, but creating pictorial harmony. A key aspect of this harmony was the color scheme. Like the other versions, it's changed over time due to fading, but before I elaborate, a little context. Van Gogh saw colour as his primary means of expression. His palette, subdued and earthy in his initial years in the Netherlands, was transformed when he arrived in Paris in 1886. He was deeply affected by the work of Eugène Delacroix, a colorist par excellence, and recognized the ways that Delacroix used color not only to model form, but also to charge his paintings with emotion and drama. Largely self-taught, he found a theoretical framework for Delacroix's use of color in the writings of Charles Blanc, which he read and copied at length. Blanc's color star from his 1884 Grammaire des Arts shows the primaries, yellow, blue, and red, and secondaries, green, violet, and orange, made by mixing the primaries on either side. Blanc explained that juxtaposing a primary color and its opposing secondary has the effect of reinforcing and complementing both. This phenomenon, known as the law of simultaneous contrasts, was first identified by physicist Eugène Chevret in a publication of 1839. Here, Delacroix heightened the drama of the terrified disciples by placing areas of red adjacent to its complementary green. One of the ways that Van Gogh explored color relationships in his own paintings was by using balls of colored yarn. In heading south to Hale, he was consciously channeling Delacroix, whose color sense had been heightened by a trip to North Africa. As he later told Theo, wanting finally to see this stronger sun because one feels that the colors of the prism are veiled in the mists of the north. From the dazzling color effects, as he called them, of his Hale paintings, during his time in Saint-Rémy, his palette became rather more subdued, his tonal values closer. He ordered tubes of less strident earth colors, yellow and red ochres, raw sienna, and often mixed his colors with lead or zinc white, so that rather than the complementaries red and green, he often used pink and green. In wanting a narrower range of tonal harmonies, he was inspired by Puvis de Chavannes, whom he increasingly felt was as important an artist as Delacroix. But this painting now evokes Puvis in a way he didn't anticipate, at least not to this degree. Out of its frame, you can see that the edges, protected by the frame rabbit, are much more strongly colored. He'd used an organic red lake pigment that faded, especially where it was mixed with white. The shadowed zone of the foreground was indeed purplish and would have provided a complementary contrast to the yellow sunlit areas. The now rather washed out sky has kept some color because here he mixed a stable, opaque red with a fugitive red lake. But the pink-green contrast that he intended would have been much more intense. Color change in Van Gogh's paintings has been a key area of technical investigation, and I'll go into more detail with the next group of paintings. In the mid-1980s, the Met mounted pioneering exhibitions on the artist's final years with Van Gogh in Hale and Van Gogh in Saint-Rémy and Auvers, and in 2005, Vincent Van Gogh The Drawings. These large-scale exhibitions have paved the way for smaller shows featuring groups of related works as a way to further explore his creative process. In focusing on the Met's exuberant still lifes of irises and roses, curator Susan Stein thought to understand the relationship between our paintings and their counterparts in the Van Gogh Museum and the National Gallery. The Met still lifes normally hang in separate galleries by stipulation of the bequest that keeps the Annenberg collection intact. So the exhibition provided an unprecedented opportunity to reunite the paintings for the first time since Van Gogh's death. Thanks to our colleagues, it was also an opportunity to collaborate in technical examinations to address questions about his materials and process, including colors that no longer match his own descriptions. With me at the top is Sylvia Centeno, and below at the Van Gogh Museum are Ella Hendricks, Louis van Telborg, and Tayo Miedendorp with Susan, and lower right at the National Gallery, Anne Honigswald and Barbara Berry. The show opened in May 2015, 125 years to the day that Vincent announced to Theo his large bouquets were underway. For the triptych of blossoming orchards painted in Arles, where he likewise combined vertical and horizontal formats, he'd made a sketch of how he pictured the ensemble. Without such a guide, we installed the still lifes in the order that we were able to determine they had been made, and thanks to our colleagues, in matching, unobtrusive frames based on a profile he'd used himself. They were painted in quick succession as he prepared to leave the asylum and head north. He was trying to make up for lost time after a period of illness that spring. He wrote Theo, "I recovered all my clarity for work. The brush strokes come like clockwork." He gathered armfuls of bearded irises and rose de Provence, cabbage roses, blooming in the asylum garden, and set to work in his makeshift studio in the men's ward. In a studio setting, he had more control than working outside, but knew that flowers wilt quickly and it's a matter of doing the whole thing in one go. On April 29th, he'd written for supplies. "Voici la liste. Here's the list of colors I need." He specified not just paints, but brushes and canvas. A persistent myth that we were keen to dispel was that his mental illness made him impetuous as an artist. As I hope you've seen, nothing could be further from the truth. Rather, he planned and strategized his painting campaigns, even congratulated himself on his ability to calculate the materials he'd need, down to the last tube of paint and meter of canvas. The turnaround for the receipt of materials was probably 1 week. He wrote on May 11th, thanking Theo for the package and saying that he'd already finished 2 of the bouquet paintings and was working on the 3rd. After moving to Provence, he generally obtained lengths of canvas from the Parisian colour merchant Tasset-Lot. Prepared with a white ground, he then cut them up himself and stretched them on stretching frames. The still lifes are all standard size 30. Automated weave mapping of the X-rays shows that the individual canvases came from the same bolt. The graphic shows the continuous warp pattern with the paintings in corresponding alignment. He started with the upright irises that in their scale and strong note of yellow pick up where he'd left off with the sunflowers in Arles. He laid in his design with boldly painted contours. You can see here where he painted up to but not over these lines, and brought the bouquet to life using thickly impasted paint applied wet into wet. It was heavily worked, especially in the background, painted directly and without changes. The bent over stems were planned from the beginning. Moving on to the horizontal irises, he used a wide mouth pitcher, perhaps he took it from his own washstand, so that the long straight stems would splay out in this remarkable composition. Gaining momentum, he worked with ease and economy. For example, he left unpainted the off-white ground to stand for the shadowed inside of the handle. In his first painting of roses, which was on his easel when he wrote to Theo on May the 11th, he maintained the horizon line of the roses. This was the only time in the series that he paused and made changes. We can imagine that he was thinking how best to approach his new motif of Rose de Provence to bring the composition into harmony with the paintings he'd already finished. To this end, he used the same traditional Provençal vase as in the upright roses at the same angle, reintroducing a note of yellow, though here in a softer hue. The spray of roses at the bottom left corner was added into still wet paint of the table. He seems initially to have planned the spray to be on the other side of the vase, where fine lines of underdrawing can be glimpsed through the brushwork, but shifted it as a counterpoint to the broken stem of the irises. And he reworked the background, replacing initial strokes that echoed the contour of the bouquet with the distinctive wavy diagonals we see now. Over the next couple of days, with the paint partially dry, he made a further change, adding the roses at the bottom of the vase. And he painted the upright version, announcing its completion to Theo on May the 13th. As with the horizontal irises, in his second painting of roses, he worked confidently and without hesitation. The bold strokes that describe the flowering leaves on the table, applied with a broad brush, are like calligraphy. In this detail from the top of the bouquet, you can see the wide, variegated strokes of the yellow and green background applied around the flowers, which were painted first. And within the rose, deep furrows in the thickly impasted paint made with a narrower brush, all handled wet into wet. Though painting at speed, he remained attentive to detail. These very fluid, fine blue lines defining the tightly packed petals must have been made with the long, narrow, so-called Fitch brushes he'd ordered with such details in mind. And how closely he observed the flowers. The form of the bloom is strikingly similar to this horticultural illustration of Rosa centiflora, the 100-petaled rose. In his letter of May 11th, he wrote, "These canvases will take a good month to dry, but the man who works here will take care of sending them after my departure." It was his standard practice to allow enough time for his canvases to dry sufficiently that they could be unstretched and stacked or rolled for transport. Because the thickest impasto was dry to the touch but still malleable, many of his paintings have areas of impasto that were flattened a bit, taking the impression of the canvas stacked above, as I hope you can see in these details. Throughout his career, he had used still lifes to explore color harmony and contrast. In Paris in 1886, he wrote that, by painting simply flowers, seeking oppositions of blue with orange, red and green, yellow and violet, he'd made progress in trying to render intense color. He considered relationships not just within a painting, but across paintings in series. He thought of the sunflowers painted in Hale as a decoration for the studio, envisaging a symphony of blue and yellow. Here he engaged two pairs of complementaries, yellow-violet and pink-green, but these four colors he played out in major and minor notes across the ensemble. He wrote to Theo, "I'm working on two canvases of rather large bouquets of violet irises. One lot against a pink background in which the effect is harmonious and soft through the combination of greens, pinks, and violets. The other, ranging up to pure carmine and Prussian blue, against a striking lemon yellow background, is an effect of terribly disparate complementaries that reinforce each other by their opposition." As yet unresolved on May the 11th, the horizontal roses he described simply as roses against a light green background. And the upright roses, finished on May the 13th, as pink roses against a yellow-green background in a green vase. But the paintings we see today no longer reflect his own vivid descriptions. Van Gogh was knowledgeable about color from theory to practice. He was highly attuned to paints available on the market, what they cost, how they handled, their risks and benefits. His paints came mainly from Julien Père Tanguy, a colorman and dealer pictured here, who often accepted paintings in exchange for supplies, and from the larger firm of Tassé-Lot. Most of the pigments that he ordered were quite recent inventions, part of an unparalleled expansion of the artist's palette in the 19th century, made possible through advances in chemical synthesis. The broadest choices were to be had in red lake pigments, which were derived from dyes and translucent in oil media. Until the mid-19th century, red lake pigments were made from dyes extracted from insects like cochineal, seen on the left, and plants like Brazil wood. Those are Brazil wood chips in the dish at the top. Van Gogh used both, marketed as carmine and ordinary lake. He also used a brilliant orangey scarlet red lake pigment that had recently come on the market. Called geranium lake, it was one of a new gamut of brightly coloured red lake pigments, ushered in by the invention of the first synthetic dye, Perkins mauve, in 1856. From his arrival in Hale in February 88 until his death in July 1890, he ordered a total of 38 tubes of geranium lake. This alluring pigment, which he seems to have identified with the strong light and brilliant colours of the south, was known to fade in the presence of light. Anticipating some degree of fading in this and other colours known to be unstable, he thought that painting thickly would mitigate the effects. He wrote to Theo from Hale, "All the colours that Impressionism has made fashionable are unstable. All the more reason boldly to use them too raw. Time will soften them only too much." Fugitive red lakes can affect paintings of all periods. In this painting by Thomas Fry from 1742, the intense pink of the now faded underskirt can be seen along the bottom edge where it was protected from light by the frame. The degree of fading of red lake pigments depends on multiple factors relating to the source of the dye, the manufacture of pigments from the dye, how the artist used it, and how much light the painting's been exposed to since. As red lakes were a key component of Van Gogh's palette, the fugitive nature of these pigments affects many of his paintings. The high tint strength of red lakes meant that only a small amount was needed to create vivid colour, and mixing red lakes with white, as he often did, especially in the Saint-Rémy period, made them all the more susceptible to fading. In this dramatic example from the Courtauld Museum, the former pink of the background is now preserved only on the tacking edges. The clear-cut compositional schemes and broad blocks of colour of the irises and roses makes the losses due to fading all the more profound. With the exhibition, we saw the opportunity to engage visitors in thinking about how colour changes impacted these paintings, both individually and, more importantly, as a group. And rather than just describing what's been lost, we wanted to present, through digital reconstructions, a sense of Van Gogh's intended results as he orchestrated two sets of complementary colours across the ensemble. To this end, we used a range of investigative approaches, exploring early documentary sources in addition to carrying out an extensive technical study. Working closely with our colleagues from the Van Gogh Museum and the National Gallery, we set about trying to piece together how the paintings looked originally. We looked at early reviews for descriptions of colour. In 1905, a Dutch newspaper was already characterizing the upright roses as white roses. Early black and white photography gives hints of lost tonal contrasts. And early colour reproductions, while unreliable in terms of colour rendering, give a sense of the distribution of colour and detail that have been lost to fading. We were fortunate to be building on studies of Van Gogh's materials and practice dating from the early 1990s. One of these that Aviva was part of involved making historically accurate paints using contemporary recipes, which were then aged artificially to simulate the effect of years of light exposure. We can't know precisely what conditions the still lifes were shown or stored in early on, but we can be sure that any exposure to daylight didn't have the most damaging wavelengths, ultraviolet, filtered out, and light levels controlled, as we do in museums today. We began with what remains visible on the picture surfaces, where colour was applied relatively pure, or was protected by ridges of impasto or by the frame. We then used a range of analytical techniques to identify and map the materials of the paintings. Tiny paint samples, no bigger than a full stop on a printed page, set in resin and ground down to show their layer structure like a slice of cake, reveal the strength of the original color lying underneath the faded surface. High-performance liquid chromatography and surface-enhanced Raman spectroscopy identified the pink colorant of the table in the roses as Brazil wood and the pink of the background of the irises as geranium lake. In this cross-section, you can see that a minute skip in the blue horizon line overlying the once pink table has allowed light through, fading the very top of the underlying pink, a mixture of Brazil wood and zinc white, which otherwise remains quite strongly colored where it was protected by the blue paint. In the cross-section from the background of the irises, the raspberry ripple effect is due in part to Van Gogh's very unhomogeneous mixture of geranium lake and lead white, which would have resulted in the kind of variation in the background that you see in the emerald green and white tabletop. A significant addition to our analytical capabilities was developed quite recently by scientists at the Delft University of Technology and the University of Antwerp. Scanning X-ray fluorescence uses an X-ray source on a rig to scan the entire painting, producing maps that show the distribution of chemical elements. And from these, the pigments can be inferred. X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, has existed for some decades for single-point analysis, but the ability to scan is a game changer, resulting in clear graphic images, maps, of where different pigments were used. Here we're seeing the lead map. Everywhere that lead white was used, notably in the background, shows as light on the image. And here you see almost the inverse, the map showing all the places that are used zinc white. Scanning XRF can even reveal the presence of color that has completely faded, as here. The synthetic dye, eosin, which provides the red color of geranium lake, contains the element bromine, an element found in no other pigment. With this bromine map, here colored red, we can see all the places that Van Gogh mixed geranium lake with blue pigments. Cobalt blue in the petals, and Prussian blue for the contours to make the various shades of violet in the irises. So how to translate all this into digital reconstructions? We worked with John Delaney, senior imaging scientist at the National Gallery, who'd undertaken much of the analytical imaging on the right, and Scott Geffert, senior imaging systems manager at the Met. Starting with precisely calibrated color photography and working in LAB, or lab color space, a 3-axis color system where the colors are exact and independent of the device they're shown on, we created templates or masks for the areas with red lakes that had faded. To obtain color coordinates of geranium lake, we used spectral measurements made with fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, or FORS, taken from within the circled areas of faded geranium lake you see on the left. And we plotted the coordinates of these faded colors in lab color space and projected from the origin, the equivalent of completely faded color, through the coordinates and into a cloud of coordinates taken from the eosin layer in a calibrated image of a paint cross-section, selecting the most saturated colors to dial back into the faded areas in the reconstruction. As other researchers have observed, there are 2 slightly different values of eosin, one orangey and one deeper red. For the table of the upright roses, a similar calculation was made. Chris Hines in the Met's imaging department built files in multiple layers that could be adjusted individually, and we consulted back and forth with our colleagues to fine-tune the results. For the presentation of the digital reconstructions in the exhibition, we wanted the images to be dynamic rather than static. Our reconstructions could only be our best estimate of the appearance of the paintings based on our examinations and documentary sources. So we decided to create videos that would run in the exhibition opposite the paintings, no audio. The Met's digital media team produced the videos, which were also available online. The one on the left presented context about Van Gogh's practice of still lifes and painting in series, and the one on the right outlined our art historical and technical investigation, ending with the digital reconstructions fading in and fading out again. Our goal was to present the material in a way that would engage but not overwhelm. Here are the 4 paintings as they appeared on the wall, and here are our digital reconstructions. We can't know all the nuances and modulations that Van Gogh brought to play in these paintings, but these are our best approximations of their original appearance. They allow us to see anew the play of complementary colors, yellow and violet, and pink and green, across the ensemble in different combinations and variations, from what he described as harmonious and soft to his terribly disparate complementaries. Comparison of the analytical imaging showed that in the vertical irises, he used a broader range of pigments, including ultramarine blue, and in addition to geranium lake, a second red lake, possibly the pure carmine he described to Theo, mixed with Prussian blue, creating an inky purple. The broader palette would have contributed to the disparate complementaries in relation to the more limited palette of his harmonious horizontal irises. Similarly, in the roses, only in the disparate upright version did he use a second red lake, Brazil wood, in the table, and in a few of the stems of the flowers, where unmixed it is wine dark. His last words about this series are particularly poignant. But even with the fading of red lakes, these paintings remain vibrant, resonant, and intensely moving, both individually and especially as a series. The videos and related research remain accessible on the museum's website, and the analysis has since been published in Heritage Science. I'd like to thank the many people involved in this work, especially my colleagues Susan and Sylvia, and I want to thank you all very much for being here.